Have you ever discovered that everything you believed about your family was a lie? That the people who raised you, who taught you right from wrong, were capable of unspeakable evil? Josephine Tain was 20 years old in the summer of 1836, when she learned that her mother wasn't the pious Charleston widow everyone admired. She was something far worse. Something that would haunt Josephine for the rest of her life. The discovery came on a thick August night when sleep wouldn't come, and the heat pressed against her skin like a wool blanket. Josephine had risen from her bed intending to fetch water from the kitchen, when she heard voices drifting up from her mother's study. Eleanor Tain never conducted business after dark, which made the late-night meeting strange enough to make Josephine pause at the top of the stairs. "That makes 3 this month." Her mother's voice came clear and cold through the open door. "The traders from Georgia will be pleased." "The new girl from the Dalton auction should yield good results," a man's voice replied. "Silas Webb, the plantation overseer. Dr. Parnell will examine her tomorrow." Josephine's hand gripped the banister as understanding crept over her like cold water. She knew about the separate building behind the mansion, the one hidden by live oaks that the enslaved people called the breeding house. She'd been told it was an infirmary, a place where sick workers received treatment. But the clinical discussion floating up from her mother's study told a different story, one that made Josephine's stomach turn. She descended the stairs in silence, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood, and pressed herself against the wall beside the study door where candlelight spilled into the hallway. Through the gap she could see her mother at her mahogany desk, ledgers spread before her, quill moving with methodical precision across pages filled with names and numbers and dates. Not cotton yields or household accounts, but something else entirely. Records of women, pregnancies, births, sales. "And Mercy's child?" Eleanor asked without looking up. "Healthy boy born this morning." Her mother smiled, and Josephine had never seen such coldness in a human expression. "Excellent. Mark him for sale at 8 weeks." Josephine fled back to her room, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She lit a candle with shaking hands and pulled out the journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. For 2 years, she'd been recording observations about the plantation's unusual operations, the frequency of Dr. Parnell's visits, the pregnant women who disappeared into the infirmary and emerged hollow-eyed months later without their babies, the careful way her mother discussed certain enslaved people, as if they were breeding livestock rather than human beings. Now, with her mother's words still echoing in her ears, all those observations coalesced into horrible clarity. Eleanor Tain was running a breeding program, deliberately impregnating enslaved women to produce children who could be sold for profit. And based on the ledgers Josephine had glimpsed, this had been happening not for months but for years, maybe even decades, stretching back to before her father's death. She wrote everything she'd overheard in tight, frantic script, her hand barely able to keep pace with her racing thoughts. When she finally set down her pen, the candle had burned low and dawn was beginning to pale the eastern sky. Josephine stared at the words she'd written and understood with terrible certainty that her life had just divided into before and after. Before, when she was merely the educated daughter of a respected widow. After, when she knew the truth and would have to decide what to do with it. Outside her window, the plantation was waking to another day of carefully maintained appearances. But Josephine Tain would never be able to pretend again. Have you ever met someone and known immediately that they would change your life forever? That first conversation where you realize this person sees the world the way you do, understands the questions that keep you awake at night. Josephine Tain met Lieutenant James Blackwood on a sweltering evening in late August, and from the moment their eyes met across her mother's parlor, she knew nothing would ever be the same. The dinner party had been arranged with Eleanor's usual precision. Thomas Blackwood, the elder brother, was being positioned as a match for Caroline, Josephine's older sister, who seemed perfectly content with their mother's machinations. James, the younger brother, recently returned from military service in the Western Territories, had been invited as an afterthought, a courtesy to round out the numbers. Josephine descended the stairs in a dress of pale blue silk that made her feel like a doll being positioned on a shelf, and found the parlor already arranged exactly as her mother preferred. Caroline laughing at Thomas Blackwood's stories, Eleanor presiding over the scene with satisfied control. And standing near the window, studying a small painting of the plantation grounds with more attention than it deserved, was James Blackwood. He turned when Josephine entered, and she found herself looking into gray eyes that held an intelligence and wariness that immediately set him apart from the usual Charleston gentleman who courted her mother's favor. "Miss Tain," he said, bowing with military precision, "your sister speaks very highly of your accomplishments." "Caroline is generous with her praise," Josephine replied carefully, taking her seat on the settee. "I understand you've spent time on the frontier, Lieutenant. That must have been quite different from Charleston." "Different barely captures it," James said, and something in his tone made Josephine look at him more closely. "The frontier strips away pretense. You see people as they truly are, without the polish of civilization to hide behind." Their conversation was interrupted by Isaiah, one of the newly arrived house slaves, entering with a tray of refreshments. Josephine watched James track the young man's movements with the careful attention of someone trained to observe details others missed. Most gentlemen barely acknowledge the enslaved people who served them, treating them as invisible. But James's eyes followed Isaiah with a focus that suggested he saw more than he should. "You seem troubled, Lieutenant," Eleanor observed from across the room, her sharp gaze missing nothing. "Is something amiss?" "Not at all, Mrs. Tain," James replied smoothly. "I was merely admiring the efficiency of your household. You run quite an operation here." Something flickered across Eleanor's face, satisfaction perhaps, or calculation. "Tomorrow I'd be pleased to show you more of the Tain plantation operations. We've implemented some innovative methods that might interest a progressive young planter." Josephine felt ice settle in her chest. Her mother never offered tours of the plantation to outsiders. What did Eleanor see in James Blackwood that made her willing to reveal her secrets? As the evening progressed through dinner, Josephine found herself seated beside James, their conversation developing a rhythm that felt both natural and dangerous. He asked questions about her education, her interests, her observations of plantation management, and beneath the polite surface of their discussion, Josephine sensed he was asking different questions entirely, testing her perhaps to see what she knew or what she might be willing to reveal. "Your mother mentioned you keep detailed records," James said quietly as dessert was being served. "Of household accounts and such. That's unusual for a young woman." Josephine's pulse quickened. "I find numbers soothing. They don't lie the way people do." "No," James agreed, holding her gaze a moment too long. "Numbers tell the truth whether we want to hear it or not." Later that night, after the Blackwoods had departed and the house had settled into sleep, Josephine added a new entry to her hidden journal. "Lieutenant James Blackwood is not what he appears to be. He watches too carefully, asks questions that cut too close to truths that should remain hidden. Mother has invited him to tour the plantation tomorrow. I don't know if he's a threat or an ally, but I know this. He's the first person I've met who might actually see what's happening here. And that terrifies me almost as much as it gives me hope. Do you remember the first time you trusted someone with a secret that could destroy you? When you looked at another person and decided that some truths are worth the risk of speaking aloud?" Josephine found James Blackwood waiting for her in the stable 3 nights after the dinner party, and in the space of one whispered conversation, her entire world shifted on its axis. She hadn't planned to meet him there. She'd gone to the stables unable to sleep, drawn by the same restless energy that had plagued her since discovering the full extent of her mother's breeding program. The humid night air hung thick with the scent of hay and horses and the jasmine that grew wild along the paddock fence. When she pushed open the stable door, she found James standing in the shadows beside her mare's stall, his face barely visible in the moonlight filtering through gaps in the wood. "Miss Tain," he said quietly, "I was hoping you'd come." Josephine's first instinct was to run, to preserve the careful distance Charleston society required between unmarried men and women. But something in his voice, urgency mixed with what sounded like relief, made her step inside instead and close the door behind her. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If anyone sees us, my reputation will be—" "I'm not here to compromise your reputation," James interrupted. "I'm here because I need to know if what I suspect about this plantation is true. And I think you're the only person who might tell me. Josephine's breath caught. What do you suspect? James moved closer, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his hat like he was trying to anchor himself. I'm not just a lieutenant, Miss Tain. I'm a federal investigator sent from Washington to confirm reports of illegal breeding operations throughout South Carolina. I've been tracking rumors about the Tain plantation for months. And after your mother's tour yesterday, he stopped, his voice rough with controlled anger. What I saw in that infirmary, what Dr. Parnell showed me while speaking about it like it was agricultural research. He couldn't finish the sentence, and Josephine was glad he didn't. She'd spent the previous day in an agony of dread, imagining what her mother had revealed to him during that tour, wondering if James Blackwood was the kind of man who would be impressed by Eleanor's efficiency or horrified by her cruelty. Now she had her answer, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her knees weak. I have records, she heard herself say. 2 years of documentation, names, dates, births, sales, everything hidden in ledgers my mother thinks no one else can access. James's eyes widened. You've been keeping evidence? I didn't know what else to do, Josephine said, her voice cracking slightly. Caroline, my older sister, she's part of it. She helps manage the breeding program. My younger sister, Beatrice, she turns 18 next month, and my mother has plans for her too. I've been writing it all down, thinking maybe someday someone would come who could stop this. But I never imagined. She broke off, suddenly aware that she was confessing treason against her own family to a man she barely knew. But James was nodding, his expression fierce with something that looked like admiration. You're incredibly brave, he said quietly. What your mother is doing, it's not just morally reprehensible, it's illegal under federal law. The international slave trade was banned in 1808. Breeding programs specifically designed to produce enslaved children for sale violate that prohibition. Can you stop her? Josephine asked, hating how desperate she sounded. With your records as evidence, yes. But I need time to coordinate with federal marshals and build an airtight case. Charleston's judiciary is corrupt. Half the judges profit from operations like this. If we move too quickly, your mother will have warning and destroy the evidence. He hesitated, then added, It means you'll have to stay here, continue pretending, while I arrange everything. Can you do that? Josephine thought about Beatrice crying herself to sleep, about the women trapped in the infirmary, about all the children already sold away from their mothers. How long? 2 weeks, maybe 3. She nodded, committing herself to a course that would destroy her family and everything she'd ever known. There's something else you should know, she said. There's a house slave named Isaiah who arrived a month ago. His sister is in the breeding house. He came here deliberately to find her. James's expression sharpened with interest. Can you arrange for me to speak with him? I think so. But Lieutenant James, if we're caught, we won't be, he said with a certainty she desperately wanted to believe. Then he did something that made Josephine's heart stutter in her chest. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against her palm, his thumb tracing the ink stains on her fingertips from her constant writing. You're not alone anymore, he said. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. And standing there in the moonlit stable with her hand in his, Josephine felt something she hadn't experienced in the 2 years since she'd started suspecting the truth about her mother. For the first time, she felt hope. There comes a night in every life when all the secrets you've been keeping suddenly collide, when the careful lies you've been maintaining shatter like glass, and you're left standing in the wreckage wondering if you'll survive what comes next. For Josephine Tain, that night came 3 weeks after her first conversation with James Blackwood, and it arrived in the form of her younger sister Beatrice, sobbing in the darkness of her bedroom. Josephine had been meeting with James every few nights in the stables, passing him copies of her mother's ledgers, building the case that would eventually bring federal marshals to the Tain plantation. They'd been careful, so careful, never meeting at the same time, never being seen together except in proper social contexts. But tonight, when Josephine entered Beatrice's room in response to muffled crying, she found more than her sister's tears. She found Caroline standing by the window, one of Josephine's journal pages clutched in her hand. How long have you been spying on Mother? Caroline asked, her voice eerily calm. How long have you been documenting our family business like we're criminals? Josephine's heart stopped. Caroline, please. I found this hidden in your floorboard, Caroline interrupted, waving the page. 2 years of records. Names, dates, accusations, and mentions of Lieutenant Blackwood. You've been meeting with him secretly. She laughed, a bitter sound. Did you really think no one would notice the stable door opening in the middle of the night? Beatrice looked between her sisters with confusion and dawning horror. What's happening? Caroline, what are you talking about? Your sister Josephine, Caroline said, her eyes never leaving Josephine's face, has decided to betray our family, to destroy everything Mother has built, all for some misguided moral superiority. What Mother has built is evil, Josephine said, her voice shaking but steady. You know it is, Caroline. You've seen those women, the children torn from their mothers. I've seen innovation, Caroline snapped. I've seen Mother take Father's failing research and turn it into something profitable and scientifically valuable. Do you know how many prominent families throughout the South have consulted with her? How many medical advances have come from Dr. Parnell's work? Medical advances built on the torture of human beings, Josephine shot back. Caroline, listen to yourself. You sound like Mother? Caroline's smile was cold. I'll take that as a compliment. She moved toward the door. I'm going to tell her about your little investigation, about your midnight meetings with the lieutenant. And then Mother will deal with both of you appropriately. No, Beatrice cried, jumping to her feet. Caroline, please, if you tell Mother. But Caroline was already gone, her footsteps echoing down the hallway toward Eleanor's study. Josephine grabbed Beatrice's hand. Listen to me. There's no time to explain everything, but James, Lieutenant Blackwood, he's a federal investigator. He's been building a case against Mother. We were waiting for marshals to arrive, but if Caroline tells her now... A scream cut through the house, coming from downstairs. Not a scream of pain, but of rage. Eleanor's voice filled with fury that made the walls seem to shake. Josephine pulled Beatrice toward the door. We have to run, right now. They fled down the servants' stairs, their nightgowns streaming behind them, and burst out into the humid night. Rain had begun to fall, warm and heavy, turning the manicured grounds into mud. Behind them, lanterns were being lit throughout the house. Men's voices shouted orders. Dogs began to bark. James was waiting in the shadows near the stables, just as they'd planned for emergencies. When he saw the sisters running toward him, he moved immediately to meet them. Federal marshals won't arrive for another 2 days, he said urgently. Can you hide that long? Not here, Josephine panted. Caroline knows everything. Mother will tear this plantation apart looking for us. Then we run now, James said. He looked at Beatrice, taking in her terrified face, and made a decision. Both of you. There's a safe house 15 miles north. We can reach it before dawn if we move fast. Isaiah appeared from the stable leading 3 saddled horses. My sister, he said to Josephine. I can't leave without Ruth. The infirmary is crawling with overseers right now, James said. If we try to reach her, then we all die, Isaiah finished grimly. I know, but I came here to save her. I won't leave her in that place. Lightning flashed, illuminating the breeding house in stark white light. Josephine could see figures moving behind the curtained windows. Shadows of women who'd never asked to be part of Eleanor's experiments. She thought about the children already sold, the mothers whose arms remained empty, all the suffering documented in her careful records. We go to the infirmary, she said, surprising even herself. We free as many women as we can carry on these horses, and then we ride like hell for the safe house. James looked at her for a long moment, and Josephine saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Respect, admiration, and something deeper she was afraid to name. You're sure? He asked. I'm sure, Josephine said. I've been writing about evil for 2 years. Tonight I'm going to do something about it. Behind them, more lanterns blazed to life in the mansion. Silas Webb's voice bellowed commands to search the grounds, and Josephine Tain, who'd spent 20 years being the obedient daughter, grabbed a horse's reins and rode toward the breeding house with nothing but desperate courage, and the hope that sometimes doing the right thing was enough to keep you alive. Have you ever been so terrified that time seemed to slow down, where every heartbeat felt like an eternity and every choice could mean life or death? Josephine would remember that night for the rest of her life. the rain soaking through her nightgown, the thunder that covered the sound of horses' hooves, the way James Blackwood looked at her when she insisted they couldn't leave anyone behind. The breeding house stood apart from the main plantation buildings, surrounded by live oaks whose branches seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers in the storm. Lights blazed in every window now. Through the rain, Josephine could see silhouettes moving inside. Dr. Parnell, Nurse Hammond, probably several overseers responding to Eleanor's alert. "The back entrance," Isaiah whispered, dismounting with practiced silence. "Phyllis in the kitchen gave me a key weeks ago before I knew you all were planning this." They left the horses tied in the tree line and moved through the downpour toward the building's rear. Josephine's heart hammered so violently she was certain everyone could hear it. Beside her, Beatrice gripped her hand with crushing strength, and James kept one hand on the revolver at his belt. Isaiah's key turned smoothly in the lock. They slipped inside into a narrow servants' corridor that smelled of carbolic and something underneath it. Fear, despair, the scent of too many bodies kept in too small a space. Voices echoed from the main hall. "Search every room," Nurse Hammond was ordering. "Mrs. Tain wants those girls found before they can leave the property." "The women in recovery," Isaiah whispered, pointing down a side passage. "Ruth is in the third room on the right." They moved like shadows, James and Isaiah leading while Josephine and Beatrice followed. The first two rooms held women too late in pregnancy to travel. But in the third room, they found Ruth, slight, hollow-eyed, nursing a weeks-old infant while staring at the rain-streaked window with the expression of someone who'd stopped hoping for rescue. She looked up when they entered, and the shock on her face when she saw Isaiah made Josephine's throat tighten. "Isaiah," Ruth breathed, clutching the baby closer. "They said you were sold south." "They said, I came back for you," Isaiah said simply. "Can you ride?" Ruth nodded wordlessly, already rising from her chair despite her weakened state. "The baby comes with us," James said firmly. "Everyone who can travel comes with us." They freed two more women from the recovery ward, both recent mothers, both able to move despite their ordeal. 5 women, 1 infant, and the 4 of them. It would slow them down terribly, make them easier to track. But as Josephine looked at Ruth's face transforming from despair to desperate hope, she knew they'd made the right choice. The alarm bell began to clang just as they reached the back door. Somewhere in the building, Nurse Hammond had discovered empty rooms. Shouts erupted. Footsteps pounded toward them. "Run!" James shouted, firing his revolver through the doorway to drive back whoever was pursuing. They burst into the storm and ran for the horses, Ruth clutching her baby to her chest while Isaiah supported her with one arm. Gunfire cracked behind them, bullets hissing through the rain. One of the freed women cried out and stumbled, but Josephine caught her and dragged her forward even as her own legs threatened to give out. They reached the horses in chaos. James practically threw women onto saddles, shouting at them to hold on no matter what. Isaiah mounted with Ruth in front of him, the baby protected between their bodies. Josephine swung onto her mare with Beatrice behind her, feeling her sister's arms lock around her waist with desperate strength. More gunfire, the sound of men crashing through underbrush, and then they were riding, mud flying from hooves, rain lashing their faces, riding north toward safety that was still 15 miles away. James led them through a route he'd scouted weeks earlier, paths that avoided main roads, following creek beds and game trails where pursuing riders would have trouble tracking them in the storm. Josephine had never ridden so hard in her life. Every muscle screamed. Her nightgown was plastered to her skin. Behind her, Beatrice sobbed with terror and exhaustion. But they didn't stop, couldn't stop, because somewhere behind them in the darkness, Eleanor Tain was marshaling her forces. Somewhere behind them, her mother was deciding whether her daughters' lives were worth less than the empire she'd built on suffering. And Josephine knew with terrible certainty that Eleanor would choose the empire. They rode through that endless night, and when dawn finally broke gray and sullen over the South Carolina low country, they were still alive. Still free, still together. It would have to be enough. They say that choosing between family and conscience is the hardest decision any person can make. But Josephine Tain learned that night that the real question isn't which you choose. It's whether you can live with yourself afterward, regardless of what you choose. The safe house was a modest cabin owned by a Quaker family, who'd been helping the Underground Railroad for a decade. They arrived as the sun rose. 5 women barely conscious from exhaustion, 1 infant miraculously sleeping through the chaos, and 4 people who'd risked everything for strangers they barely knew. The Quaker woman, whose name was Ruth like Isaiah's sister, took one look at their mud-splattered, rain-soaked group and ushered them inside without questions. Hot broth appeared. Clean, dry clothes, blankets that smelled of lavender and safety. Josephine sat by the fire wrapped in a quilt, watching Isaiah hold his sister while she cried, and felt something break open in her chest. Grief and relief so tangled together she couldn't separate them. "You saved them," James said quietly, sitting down beside her. He'd positioned himself between Josephine and the door, she noticed, as if even here he was prepared to defend them. "We saved them together," Josephine corrected. Then with brutal honesty, "But I destroyed my family to do it." "Your family destroyed itself," James said. "You just refused to be part of the destruction anymore." Federal marshals arrived 2 days later with warrants for Eleanor Tain's arrest. The evidence Josephine had gathered, her 2 years of meticulous documentation, was enough to shock even Charleston's corrupt judiciary. The trial lasted 3 months and became a national scandal. Newspapers from Boston to New Orleans carried stories about the widow, who'd run a breeding program for 20 years, who'd treated human beings like livestock, who'd planned to induct her own daughters into her empire of cruelty. Eleanor was sentenced to federal prison. Dr. Parnell faced criminal charges for his experiments. Caroline, as an accomplice, spent 2 years in a women's reformatory. The Tain plantation was seized and sold, the proceeds used to compensate victims as much as money could ever compensate for what had been taken from them. And Josephine? She and Beatrice left South Carolina forever. They couldn't stay in a place where everyone knew their family name, where every street corner held memories of the lies they'd lived. They moved to Philadelphia first, then Boston, where Josephine found work teaching mathematics at a girls' school, and Beatrice studied music and slowly stopped flinching at sudden noises. A year after the trial ended, James Blackwood arrived in Boston with a small velvet box in his pocket, and a question he'd been carrying since that night in the stables, when Josephine had first trusted him with the truth. "I know you've given up everything," he said as they walked through Boston Common on a clear October afternoon. "Your family, your home, your place in the only society you've ever known. And I know I have no right to ask anything more of you. But Josephine," he stopped walking and turned to face her. "I've spent a year trying to imagine my life without you in it, and I can't. I don't want to. Will you marry me?" Josephine looked at this man who'd seen her at her most desperate and most brave, who'd believed her when believing her meant risking his career, who'd ridden through a storm to save strangers because she'd asked him to. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." They wed in a small Boston church with Beatrice as witness and Isaiah and Ruth in attendance. It was nothing like the grand Charleston wedding Eleanor had once planned for her daughters. It was better. They had 33 years together. James left federal service to work with abolition societies, using his military training to help coordinate Underground Railroad routes. Josephine wrote extensively about plantation breeding programs, her first-hand testimony helping to expose similar operations throughout the South. They never had children of their own. Some legacies Josephine felt were better left to end, but they helped raise Isaiah and Ruth's 3 children, and watched Beatrice eventually marry a Boston doctor who treated her with the gentleness she deserved, and built lives that mattered precisely because they'd chosen conscience over comfort. Eleanor Tain died in prison in 1849, still insisting she'd done nothing wrong, that her work had been scientifically important and morally justified. She never wrote to her daughters, never asked for forgiveness, never acknowledged that treating human beings as property was evil regardless of how efficiently you did it. Josephine learned of her mother's death from a terse newspaper notice and felt nothing. No grief, no relief, just a hollow acknowledgement that the woman who'd given her life had been a stranger all along. When Josephine herself died in 1869 at age 53, James held her hand and told her she'd been the bravest person he'd ever known. They're buried together in a Boston cemetery under a stone that reads simply, "She chose truth when silence would have been easier." And sometimes, Late at night, people walking past their grave claim they can still hear whispers on the wind. Not words exactly, but a feeling that resonates in the chest like a question we all must answer eventually. When you discover evil, do you look away to preserve your own comfort? Or do you act, even knowing that action will cost you everything you've ever known? Josephine Tain looked evil in the face and chose to act. That choice cost her a family, a home, a place in society. But it gave her something worth far more. It gave her the ability to look at herself in the mirror every morning for the rest of her life and recognize the woman looking back, flawed, damaged, but fundamentally decent. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. If Eleanor Tain's story disturbs you, good. It should. Evil often hides behind respectability and wealth. Here's my question. Would you have Josephine's courage to expose your own family if you discovered they were doing evil? Tell me honestly in the comments. And subscribe to this channel, because next week's story about a mother who poisoned her daughters is even darker. Hit that button now.